My dear students of 9A and 9B, welcome to my history class. Today I shall teach you about local self-government under the Cholas and Chola Art and Architecture. Now, local self-government under the Cholas. The Cholas introduced a good system of administration, as I mentioned you earlier. And in this administrative sphere, the Cholas introduced local self-government in villages. And this is one of the most important achievements of the Cholas. They introduced local self-government in the villages. The villages were run with the help of various assemblies. These assemblies were known as UR, Sabha, Mahasabha, etc., etc. UR was the assembly of such villages who basically held some land, and the Sabha was the assembly of villagers of Brahmadeva villages. That means that villages whose lands were tax free. Those villages were known as Deva villages. These villages were known as Brahmadeva. Brahmadeva means tax-free land grants extended towards them, because most of them basically were poor. They does not have adequate income. That's why they were given land grants, and the taxes also are exempted. Various committees also were formed in order to look after the welfare works of the villagers, and there was a fair degree of autonomy, and judicial matters also were looked after by the village headman. And they formed welfare of the committee was formed in order to welfare the all-round work, in order to welfare of the villages, in order to fulfill the minimum and basic needs of the villagers. Besides, they control revenue affairs, they maintain roads, they provided irrigation facilities, etc., etc. The government supervised the working of the committees, since the government sanctioned money. That's why periodically the government supervised the workings of the committees. There was a separate public works department which constructed roads, dams, temples, and mines, and these were the important works were done by the public PWD, public works department. 1/6 of the total produce was collected as land revenue. So taxes were imposed on water, only on water, on mines, handlooms, customs and trade. So the tax collected by the government was spent on various welfare measures and sponsored by the government. So that's why the local self-government under the Cholas improved, and the people accepted the Cholas to be their popular rulers, and most of the Chola rulers, they gain popularity, respect from their villagers, from their village men. Now the Chola art and architecture. Next point, the Chola art and architecture. The Cholas are most renowned for their art and architecture. The Cholas were very much careful to their duties and responsibilities of introducing a good system of art and architecture. That's why the art and architecture, what we saw from different buildings, monuments, temples which were constructed by the Chola kings, had a different style of art and architecture. It was not compared to other style of art and architecture of our country. It was totally different than that of the art and architecture of other parts of India. Why? Because it belonged to only the Chola art and architecture. The ideas were found out by the Chola kings, and hence there was a different style of art and architecture and of the Chola kings. Temples of this period were elaborate. There were various places of worship, but temples were the places of worship, but at the same time, temples were the centers of social interaction. Many people worked in the temples. They not only looked after the worships and works of the temples for worshipping and for arranging, worships, but at the same time they also looked after the works of, all-round development of the country. They looked after the works of the committees. The committees usually conducted meetings, seminars from the courtyards of the temples, and at the same time they would make food in order to serve the people who would come to attend the meetings and seminars. So, and at the same time, the temples were the center of education. So the priests who were the employees of the temples, they taught the peoples, taught the villagers, taught the countrymen who would come to receive education from them, and the priests taught them, and ultimately they would become the villagers, the village men, and their children would become educated under their care. The art and sculpture of the temple had a very earthy representation of people and performing daily duties, which was in tune in Hindu philosophical thought. And that's why during the time of the Cholas rule, there were panels depicting musicians and dancers. Various types of scenes were depicted on the surface of the wall or on the wall of the temples, and there were so many flower sellers would come to sell their flowers in front of and sat in front of the temples in order to sell their flowers to the worshippers who would come to worship their deities. And there were market scenes in front of the temples. Birth, weddings, festive celebrations also were done in the paneled layers showing the hierarchical structure of society. Various scenes are depicted on the wall of the temples. One of the important and magnificent temples during Chola reign was the Bryodaswara Temple or Rajarajeshvara Temple. It was constructed by Raja I, as I mentioned you earlier. I taught you earlier. Raja I was a famous ruler of the Chola dynasty who constructed the Bryodaswara Temple or Rajarajeshvara Temple. And on the wall of the Rajarajeshvara Temple, there were various types of scenes are depicted till it is a wonder. That's why the visitors of different parts of the world till today come to visit the Bryodaswara Temple. And why? Because of its art, because of its architecture. It attracts millions of people of the world. They usually come to visit the temple, which was constructed by whom? Which was constructed by Raja I, the famous ruler of the Chola dynasty, my dear students. The most magnificent temple built during this time was Bryodaswara Temple, done by Raja I. It has a massive single block of stone on the top, and it is a testimony to the engineering skill of the Chola builders who could raise such a weight without modern cranes or other technology. Can you imagine? During that time there was no modern crane, there was no technology like that, but it was constructed such a magnificent and one of the largest temples constructed by Raja I during that period. And the bronze image of Nataraja also posed a cosmic motion inside the temple. And it is also said that it is an impressive piece of art of that period. And another thing is that it is a scientific wonder. The scientific wonder, that is the shadow during sunlight, during scorching rays of sun, or during when the sun gives light, no shadow comes on the ground. No shadow of the Bryodaswara Temple comes on the ground from any side. What a scientific wonder! You see, no shadow is found on the ground. No shadow of the Bryodaswara Temple is found on the ground. So this temple was constructed in such a way, no shadow is found on the ground. No shadow of that temple is found on the ground. What an engineering skill and magnificent engineering skills of the Chola builders they used. Anyway, the temple is 65 meters high and is built in such a way, as I mentioned earlier, that its shadow does not fall. Its shadow does not fall on the ground. The temple designed on the base of rules of the Vastu Shastra, which is the treatise on architecture, and entrances are flanked by the Daruka palaces, and there are numerous inscriptions in Sanskrit in the temple are preserved, are kept, and the pillar corridors surrounded the shrine allowed devotees to circumambulate the Lord Shiva. The mandapa, or the pillared hall with elaborately carved pillars and a flat roof, was usually built in front of the sanctorium, and it was used for ceremonial purposes. It was used for meetings. It was used for religious discussions. It was used for debates. And one moved inner corridor to the outer ones, that is known as Gopuram. Gopuram was the entrance of the temple. Each and every temple there was an entrance. That entrance gate was known as Gopuram. This entrance gate is known as Gopuram. This is a part of Chola Art and Architecture. Gopuram means gateways, grew in size and became more elaborate. The temples were built in two styles, rock cut and structural. Rock cut stone temples were carved out of a single block and structural temples were built. The structural temples were built built with pieces of carved rock put together. The Kailasnath temple in Maharashtra is an example of a rock-cut temple, while in Shore temple of Mahabalipuram are structural temples. These are the examples of different temples of India. Some temples are rock-cut temples and some temples are structural temples. Now, what is the basic difference between these two type of temples, rock-cut temples and structural temples? In rock-cut temples, the rocks which were used in constructing the temples, before setting it, the rocks were duly cut up, and then rocks were placed one by one after one, and then it would become a designful temple. This technique and method was known as rock-cut temple. And the structural temples mean where a structure was built And with that structure, the temple was constructed. This system of architecture is known as structural architecture, structural form of temple. So in India, there are two types of temples found. Number one, rock cut temple, and number two, structural temples. Kailasnath temple is rock cut temple, and Sword temple in Maharashtra is known as Mahabalipuram is known as structural temple, structured temple, and the structural temple. And a characteristic feature of the Dravidian style of architecture was also pyramidal, which was followed by the South Indian kings. Sikara structure on top of the Vimana, which housed in Garbhagriha or Sanctum Sanctorium. Each temple had its own set of temple dancers and musicians who lived and experimented with their art of generations based on the Sanskrit texts and Natya Sastra. So it dealt with methods to be used in performing arts and what is today referred to as the Carnatic music and dance. Puranas and epic stories of the Ramayana and Mahabharata are inscribed on the wall of the temple and designful. Nitya is given special importance because the two style of nitya is followed while constructing this type of temples, and Nataraja style of nitya, and at the same time the style followed that is Carnatic music and Carnatic dance form. It was a number of figures, number of dancers, images also were made while constructing the temples on the walls of the temples in order to communicate the message that the Chola kings were fond of art and architecture, dance and music. That's why the temples which were constructed by the Cholas, it communicated a message of the Chola rulers, that Chola rulers were not only good administrators, not only good kings, but also were great patrons of art, architecture, music and dances. So these are the today's teaching, my dear students. Next day I shall start teaching from the next points. Up to this, thank you.